December 8, 1941. Dawn broke unevenly across the Pacific, reaching some islands before others, carrying with it the sound of engines, the tremor of artillery, and the clipped certainty of official declarations. In Washington, statements were drafted with deliberate care. In Tokyo, communiques were issued with solemn resolve. Across the newspapers of the world, the language of strategy and destiny took shape, clean and declarative. War once again had acquired dates, arrows on maps, and the calm geometry of planning rooms. Yet far from those centers, on muddy airstrips, in jungle clearings, aboard transport ships heavy with fuel and sweat, the war arrived not as an abstraction but as a presence, felt first in the body, in the tightening of the jaw, in the sudden attention paid to the weight of a man's equipment. Official histories would later describe movements of divisions and the outcomes of engagements. They would note the superiority of one weapon system over another, the success or failure of doctrine, the adaptability of forces under pressure. Medals would be struck. Citations would be written. But in the opening weeks, before the narratives hardened, the war was experienced unevenly, quietly, and often in confusion. Men encountered one another at close distances, sometimes close enough to see stitching on uniforms, the wear on leather, the fine grit of sand clinging to sweat-darkened skin. It was here, in these intimate spaces between opposing bodies, that assumptions, cultural, technological, psychological, were tested without ceremony. Among Japanese infantry units advancing rapidly through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, confidence was not merely encouraged, it was cultivated as a necessity. Training emphasized spirit, endurance, and the primacy of the offensive will. The enemy, when discussed, was often rendered in simplified terms. American soldiers, it was said, relied too heavily on machines, on distance, on firepower without resolve. Stories circulated quickly in camps and bivouacs, passed along over bowls of rice and thin soup, or murmured during night watches. The American sidearm in particular, the pistol, became a point of casual dismissal. Compared to the long rifles and bayonets drilled into muscle memory, a handgun seemed an afterthought, a symbol of excess rather than seriousness. It was small. It required proximity. It did not fit easily into the prevailing image of decisive combat. Such judgments were rarely formalized. They lived instead in tone, in laughter, in the offhand gestures of men cleaning their weapons. A pistol was something an officer carried or a machine gunner as backup. It was not a weapon that shaped expectations. In some units, captured examples were examined briefly and set aside. The metal was noted as heavy. The grip as awkward. There were comments about slow firing, about recoil. These observations were not malicious. They were practical, shaped by training and by the early successes that seemed to confirm every assumption. Confidence, after all, is most persuasive when it is unchallenged. On the American side, the experience was markedly different. Many of the men who would soon rely on pistols had not expected to do so. They were aviators shot down over unfamiliar terrain, tank crewmen whose vehicles had burned, radio operators separated from their units. The Colt automatic pistol issued to them was not romanticized. It was heavy on the hip, uncomfortable in the heat, its leather holster stiff and prone to cracking. Ammunition was limited. Training with it had been brief. Yet it was carried because regulations required it, and because there was a quiet understanding, rarely spoken aloud, that in certain moments, it might be the only thing left. The environment in which these encounters occurred shaped everything. Jungle air pressed in, thick with rot and sweetness. The ground, when not rock-hard, dissolved into mud underfoot. Sounds carried unpredictably. A snapped twig might echo while shouted orders vanished into foliage. At night, insects created a constant hiss, broken only by distant gunfire or the dull thud of shells landing somewhere unseen. In such conditions, distance collapsed. Lines blurred. Weapons designed for ranges measured in hundreds of yards were suddenly unwieldy. What remained was proximity and the human response to it. It was here, in these compressed spaces, that the disparity between expectation and experience began to emerge. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in fragments. A patrol that did not return. A body examined with professional detachment, noting entry wounds that seemed out of proportion to the weapon believed to have caused them. A brief report filed, its language careful and unemotional, mentioning a sidearm where one had not been anticipated. These moments did not yet alter doctrine or belief. They unsettled instead at a more private level. Among Japanese troops, reactions varied. Some dismissed the incidents as anomalies. Others adjusted, subtly, without acknowledgement. The laughter grew less frequent. Captured pistols were no longer set aside so casually. Officers reminded their men not to underestimate any enemy weapon. Yet the earlier assumptions did not disappear, they coexisted uneasily with new observations. It is difficult, in the midst of forward momentum, to admit that something small and previously disregarded might demand attention. For the Americans involved, the experience was rarely spoken of afterward, even among themselves. The act of using a pistol at close range was intimate in a way that rifle fire was not. It required looking directly at another person, feeling the recoil not just in the arm but in the chest. The sound was sharp, concussive, final in its echo. The smell of burned powder lingered briefly, distinct from the omnipresent dampness. There was no room in these moments for the language of strategy. Only later would reports translate them into acceptable terms. Observers, medics, chaplains, intelligence officers, noticed changes that were difficult to quantify. A hesitation where there had been certainty. A new attention paid to sidearms during inspections. Conversations that trailed off when certain topics arose. None of this reached the level of official concern. Wars are not altered by such small shifts, at least not immediately. Yet they accumulate, altering the internal landscape of those who carry them. The paradox lay not in the weapon itself but in what it represented. A pistol, long regarded as secondary, began to occupy an outsized psychological space. It challenged assumptions about hierarchy, of weapons, of training, of cultural confidence. It did so quietly, without the spectacle that history often prefers. There were no grand announcements, no revised doctrines issued in response. Only the gradual recognition that proximity changes everything, and that under certain conditions, the smallest instruments can exert the greatest pressure. As the war continued, official narratives moved on to larger engagements, to aircraft carriers and island campaigns that would define the conflict in public memory. Yet beneath those accounts remained these earlier moments, unresolved, carried by individuals who rarely spoke of them. In the silence between remembered laughter and newly learned caution, a question lingered: what happens to belief when it is undone not by overwhelming force, but by a single, unexpected sound at arm's length? The days that followed settled into patterns that felt, at first, deceptively ordinary. 4 Japanese infantry units advancing through captured territory, routine asserted itself quickly. Rice was issued in measured portions, sometimes supplemented by dried fish or pickled vegetables carried from earlier depots. Boots were removed at the end of marches, feet inspected for sores, socks aired on rifle barrels or hung from low branches. Weapons were cleaned with habitual care. Rifles were wiped down, bolts oiled sparingly, bayonets checked for looseness. The work filled time and steadied nerves. It reinforced the sense that things were proceeding as expected. American prisoners and stragglers experienced a parallel monotony, stripped of its assurances. Those captured early were gathered into makeshift holding areas, schoolyards, plantation sheds, open fields ringed by sentries. The food was unfamiliar and insufficient. Rice again, but unseasoned, sometimes undercooked, clinging to the fingers. Water was rationed and warm. Clothing stiffened with sweat and dirt, seams rubbed raw against the skin. Watches were taken, rings removed. Pistols, if still possessed at the moment of capture, were confiscated and dropped into canvas sacks without comment. It was during these intervals, after the noise of contact had passed but before any settled understanding could form, that stories began to circulate more freely. Japanese soldiers spoke among themselves about encounters that had unsettled them. Not in formal reports, but in the half-light of evenings, voices low, the smell of wood smoke hanging in the air. One man described a sentry found dead near a trail, no rifle shots heard beforehand. Another mentioned a brief clash in undergrowth where an American officer, already wounded, had fired at close range with unexpected effect. The details were inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, but they shared a common feature. The pistol appeared where it was not supposed to matter. Official observations, when they existed, were cautious. Intelligence summaries noted the presence of Colt automatic pistols among American personnel, standard issue to officers and certain specialists. There was no emphasis placed on their lethality beyond established knowledge. Handguns were not considered decisive weapons. They were listed, categorized, and filed away. Yet on the ground, perception operates independently of paperwork. Daily life pressed on. Patrols were mounted. Roads were repaired using local labor. Guard rotations were assigned, often to younger soldiers eager to prove reliability. It was during these watches, long hours marked only by the slow passage of light and shadow, that attention sharpened. A holster on a captured American uniform drew a second glance. A discarded pistol found near a crashed aircraft was picked up, weighed, examined more carefully than before. The metal was cold even in the heat. The slide moved smoothly with a firmness that suggested intention. Some men dry-fired it, flinching slightly at the sound. Among American troops still in the field, particularly those operating in fragmented units, the pistol acquired a new gravity. Men who had previously regarded it as an encumbrance now checked it repeatedly. Ammunition was counted and recounted. Magazines were wiped clean, springs tested with nervous thumbs. In diaries later recovered, brief notes appeared. Mentions of keeping it close, or all that was left. The language was spare, almost embarrassed. No one wrote of pride. The pistol was a contingency made real. One airman, down during a hurried evacuation, recalled years later the sound his boots made on unfamiliar soil as he ran. His rifle had been lost with the aircraft. The pistol remained heavy against his side. He remembered thinking, absurdly, of the training range back home, the paper targets punctured cleanly at short distances. When the moment came, there was no room for memory. Only the sensation of the grip biting into his palm, the smell afterward, sharp and metallic, cutting through the jungle's sweetness. He did not linger. He did not look back. In his account, the event occupied a single paragraph, surrounded by longer descriptions of hunger and fear. For Japanese troops encountering these moments indirectly, through bodies discovered, through altered patrol behavior, the effect was cumulative. Confidence did not evaporate, it shifted. Orders began to emphasize caution during close inspections. Sentries were paired more often. Bayonets were fixed even during routine tasks. None of this was attributed explicitly to pistols. The word itself rarely appeared in discussions of preparedness. Instead, there was talk of unexpected resistance, or individual action. Guards assigned to prisoners noticed changes in themselves as well. Some admitted, privately, to unease when approaching captives for searches or roll calls. The distance between bodies felt shorter. The hands of the prisoners were watched more closely. Holsters on Japanese belts were checked instinctively, even though most contained only sidearms of lesser caliber, rarely fired. An officer recorded in his notebook a reminder to maintain proper spacing. He did not explain why. Civilians, caught in between, observed these shifts without fully understanding them. Farmers watched soldiers handle weapons with increased deliberation. Children noticed pistols being examined rather than ignored. In markets that reopened under occupation, conversations included fragments of rumor. An American weapon that struck hard at close range, a shot heard once instead of many. Such stories changed with each telling, but they carried a kernel of altered expectation. There were moments of direct confrontation that left deeper impressions. In one instance, during a nighttime sweep of a village believed to be abandoned, a Japanese patrol encountered a lone American technician hiding in a storage shed. He was exhausted, dehydrated, his uniform torn. The exchange was brief. Later, those present struggled to describe it coherently. The sound was described as louder than expected, the effect immediate. The technician did not escape. Neither did the earlier certainty about how such encounters would unfold. Observers from higher command visited forward areas and noticed the tension without naming it. They commented on alertness, on discipline. They praised vigilance. No one suggested a re-evaluation of weapon hierarchies. Yet training lectures included new admonitions about underestimating the enemy. The phrasing was general enough to preserve doctrine, specific enough to resonate. For American units, particularly those reorganizing after early losses, the pistol's role remained ambiguous. It was not celebrated. It was not emphasized in after-action reports beyond factual mention. Yet among men who had used it, there was a quiet acknowledgement shared through glances or brief remarks. Close work, someone would say, and the conversation would move on. The pistol became associated not with victory but with moments where choices narrowed to a single action. Food shortages, disease, and exhaustion soon overshadowed these earlier encounters. Malaria and dysentery occupied more attention than weapon calibers. Boots rotted. Equipment failed. Men on both sides grew thinner, quieter. The war expanded, drawing focus toward larger operations. Yet the psychological shift induced by those early, intimate clashes did not vanish. It settled like sediment, altering the internal landscape. In some Japanese units, training exercises began to include scenarios emphasizing sudden contact. Recruits were reminded that even wounded or isolated enemies remained dangerous. The emphasis was subtle, framed as common sense rather than correction. Instructors did not mention pistols by name. They did not need to. The men listening already carried their own images. American veterans, interviewed decades later, often struggled to articulate what those moments had meant. They spoke more easily about marches, about fear of bombardment, about the relief of resupply. When pistols were mentioned, it was often with a pause. One man described the sound again, softer now, filtered through time. Another spoke of the weight on his belt, how he noticed it differently afterward. None framed it as heroism. It was simply something that had happened, something that stayed. As the conflict pressed forward, the early paradox remained unresolved. A weapon dismissed as secondary had intruded upon belief systems without overturning them. It had not rewritten the war. It had, instead, complicated it at the level where wars are actually lived, between individuals at distances measured not in maps but in breath. And within that complication, tension continued to build, unspoken, carried forward into the next encounters, waiting for circumstances that would again collapse distance and demand reckoning. In the months that followed those early encounters, separation took many forms. Units moved on, absorbed into larger formations or ground down by attrition. Prisoners were transferred inland, their identities reduced to numbers, their earlier moments of proximity sealed off behind layers of routine suffering. Others never entered any ledger at all. The places where pistols had been fired, jungle clearings, storage sheds, narrow trails, returned quickly to their previous silence. Leaves closed over disturbed ground. Rain erased footprints. Only those who had been present carried the residue forward. For some Japanese soldiers, the war's later phases offered little opportunity to revisit those first unsettling impressions. Larger battles imposed their own logic, dominated by artillery, air power, and massed assaults. In those settings, the pistol receded once more into the background, overshadowed by weapons that operated at scale. Yet the earlier doubt did not entirely dissolve. It surfaced unexpectedly, in the tightening of muscles during inspections, in the careful way bodies were approached after contact. It lingered as a caution that had no official language. American survivors experienced a different kind of dispersal. Many were reassigned, evacuated, or rotated home before the war's end. Their pistols were turned in, logged, and stored, indistinguishable from thousands of others. Civilian life offered few contexts in which to speak about what those weapons had meant. The acts themselves did not fit comfortably into prevailing narratives of the war, which favored distance and machinery, the impersonal sweep of fleets and divisions. When mentioned at all, they were framed as footnotes, necessary but unremarkable. Memory, however, does not follow archival priorities. In later years, veterans recalled small, precise details that official histories ignored. The way leather stiffened in the heat. The sound of a single shot echoing too long in confined space. The expression on another man's face at the instant distance disappeared. These recollections surfaced unbidden, often decades later, during interviews or in private moments. They were not accompanied by claims of importance. They were offered instead as facts that had resisted erasure. Japanese accounts, when accessible, revealed similar patterns. Diaries written in careful script spoke of vigilance and discipline, but occasionally paused on moments of surprise or confusion. A few mentioned American weapons in passing without emphasis. One noted simply that close encounters are unpredictable. Such observations were rarely expanded upon. They did not align easily with post-war explanations that sought clarity in defeat or justification in sacrifice. Like their American counterparts, these writers seemed content to leave the moments intact but unexplained. As years passed, the war acquired a more stable shape in public memory. Museums displayed rifles, aircraft, and artillery pieces, each labeled with specifications and statistics. Pistols appeared too, but as accessories, sidearms worn by officers, symbols of rank rather than agents of change. Visitors passed them quickly, pausing longer before larger exhibits. The idea that such a weapon might have unsettled assumptions at a critical moment did not register easily in these curated spaces. Yet among historians and oral history collectors, fragments continued to surface. A recorded interview where a former guard described his unease around prisoners. A letter in which an airman confessed that the pistol had frightened him more than any other weapon he carried. These materials resisted synthesis. They did not point toward a revised understanding of the war, only toward its uneven texture. They suggested that beneath the dominant narratives lay layers of experience that did not cohere neatly. The paradox endured because it was never fully confronted. A weapon dismissed before the war, then briefly elevated by circumstance, returned afterward to its original status. Doctrine adjusted only marginally if at all. Cultural assumptions proved resilient. What changed was internal and individualized. Belief bent without breaking. The men who experienced that bending carried it alone. In reunions held years later, conversations circled familiar ground. Weather, food, marches, the relief of survival. Occasionally someone mentioned close calls, and there would be nods of recognition. Pistols were rarely named. When they were, it was without elaboration. The shared understanding did not require detail. It rested instead on a mutual recognition of how narrow certain margins had been. For those who did not survive, the matter ended where it began, in places unnamed, in moments unrecorded. Their deaths were absorbed into totals and timelines, stripped of the particularities that had defined them. Whether a pistol played a role was irrelevant to the broader accounting. The war moved on regardless. Time softened some recollections and sharpened others. The smell of burned powder faded less readily than the memory of commands shouted in foreign languages. The weight of a pistol, once returned, seemed to persist in the hand long after it was gone. Such sensations resisted interpretation. They existed as residues, reminders that war is experienced not only through strategy and outcome but through contact that leaves no clear moral or historical trace. In reflecting on these moments, later generations struggled to place them. They did not alter campaigns or decide battles. They did not redeem or condemn. They merely complicated. They suggested that certainty, technological, cultural, psychological, is fragile when compressed into the space between two people. That even in wars defined by scale, history can pivot briefly on intimacy. The Colt .45, heavy and unadorned, survives today in collections and photographs, its reputation shaped largely by institutional memory. It is remembered as reliable, powerful, effective. What it unsettled, briefly and quietly, is harder to catalog. That disruption lives instead in pauses, in the things veterans hesitated to say, in the way some stories ended sooner than expected. Long after the war's end, after declarations had been signed and territories relinquished, after uniforms were folded away, the echo of those early assumptions remained faintly audible. Not as accusation or lesson, but as a reminder of how easily belief can be undone at close range, and how rarely history lingers there to ask what was lost or learned in the space of a single shot.